What happened to Diadora? They went from being the chosen boot of a 3-time Ballon d'Or winner to then filing for bankruptcy nearly 20 years later. So let's take a look at the rise and the fall of Diadora. Where did it all start? Well, in 1948, and like most of these kit manufacturers, Diadora was founded in Italy. In Serrano di San Marco, Marcello Danieli founded the company. The original focus was in a workshop making handmade mountain boots. Apparently the word actually derives from Diadoria, which is a Greek word for sharing gifts and honour. But it was in the 1960s where Diadora shifted their attention to sportswear. This was accelerated where they were able to acquire certain patents in the US, which allowed them to start making shoes mainly for squash and tennis players. The first superstar Diadora was able to acquire, it's undoubtedly Bjorn Borg. I know we're a football channel, right? But let's quickly discuss the man won 5 Wimbledons in a row and didn't retire due to injury. The guy just lost motivation. They created the B Elite tennis shoe where they were able to capitalise on Borg's huge success, which helped bring Diadora into the mainstream. But in terms of football, the first footballer they worked with was Roberto. After seeing the success in tennis, Diadora wanted Bettega to sport Diadora boots in the 1978 World Cup. He was seen in a black pair of boots with a famous yellow stripe on the side. The football boot world in the 70s was nowhere near, even the levels of the 90s, never mind the modern day, so I'm sure it felt like everything was up for grabs. Going into the 80s, Diadora accelerated their market presence. They dabbled with some domestic football kits. However, they started to also sponsor the Milan basketball team and also were able to partner with the late great Ayrton Senna. Supposedly, they were one of the first companies to develop fireproof footwear for F1 drivers, which Senna would go on to wear for most of his career. But in the footballing world, the late 80s was where Diadora would somewhat become a football giant, especially in their home nation. After swapping between multiple different kit suppliers during this decade, Diadora were able to secure the rights for the Italian national team. Their first kit was for the 1986 World Cup in Mexico. Unfortunately, Italy lost 2-0 in the round of 16 against France. Correct me if I'm wrong if you're Italian, but it kind of feels like the 80s was a bit of a grey area for the Italian national team. And as I always say, iconic kits, yes, they are made because of the designs, but they're also made because of the team's success that wear them. And unfortunately, Italy just had absolutely none of that, especially in the late 80s. But before we move on to the next decade, we have to discuss the footballer that took Diadora to the next level. People could argue, just for his short prime, he might be the best striker of all time, and he goes by the name of Marco van Basten. Whilst Puma, Adidas and Lotto were dominating the football boot market, it was in 1988 where Van Basten would start to wear Diadora boots, especially in Euro 88. This is widely regarded as the best individual tournament performance, maybe ever. Of course, the hat-trick versus England, but the Diadora boots were used to score maybe the best tournament goal of all time, and that was the volley against the Soviet Union. This was also followed by Van Basten and co winning back-to-back European Cups. So Van Basten was creating a legacy to become one of the best players who ever played football, and he was wearing Diadora boots. In 1990, Diadora would also make the kit again for the Italian national team, but this would be in preparation for the iconic World Cup, Italia 90. Yes, this was essentially the same kit as the 1986 one, but I wasn't alive. It feels like Italia 90 has such a nostalgic feeling, especially in this country. Maybe because it preceded the Football Italia show that was shown on Channel 4 in the UK. But regardless, it let Diadora feature on the home team of one of the most iconic tournaments ever. But throughout the 90s, it wasn't really football shirts that made Diadora a respectable name. It was football boots, or at least the players that wore them. Again, just really quickly going to stop it here. I've seen most of you guys who watch my videos aren't subscribed. Really appreciate it if you could hit that subscribe button so I can keep on pushing this channel, keep on growing it. As always, thank you so much for the support. But yeah, we'll get back to the video. Other than Italy, they didn't have a big roster of teams who wore Diadora kits. However, if you want to look at the players who wore their boots, Roberto Baggio wore them for most of his career. Weah also wore some very distinctive red boots. Van Basten was still Diadora's poster boy, but he had a premature retirement in 1995. Even the legendary ray of sunshine that is Roy Keane was renowned for wearing Diadora boots for most of his career. I think to me, despite having all of these world-class players wear the football boots, they were just limited in design. you look today and back at the 90s, nothing has really changed. It's the same pattern, it's just a different colour. I mean, if we're being honest, they look like generic football boots you'd use on your creator player in FIFA. But going back to the Italian national team, I'd argue the partnership hit its peak, and that was for the 1994 World Cup. It was Diadora's last run with the country, and post that it kind of turned into a golden generation for Italy. I mean, you could argue not just the kit, but the entire tournament was overshadowed by the classic "the man who died standing" penalty miss by Roberto Baggio. But I'd argue Diadora probably created Italy's most iconic kit, at least the actual design of it. It was brilliant, it had faded patterns in the background, it was a beautiful colour, I love the badge, but that penalty miss would be the last time an Italian player kicked a ball in that kit. Like I say, in the 90s, Diadora just didn't really diversify, with companies like Kappa, Umbro, Reebok, as well as the giants of Adidas and Nike supplying all of the best teams in Europe. Diadora didn't. Here's a list of their best domestic teams throughout this decade: Union Berlin, FC Nantes, St. Pauli, and other than Italy, the only big name international team in the majorities of the 90s was Belgium, and they were nowhere near the quality of the Belgian teams we've seen over the last 10 years. Really, it wasn't until 1997 but Diadora were able to secure the rights to make the Roma kit. Look, there's a lot of quality Roma shirts knocking about, but the 1998 one is an all-timer. I mean, look at the Remus and Romulus symbolism on the sleeves. It was an initial brief 3-year period, but let me ask the maybe 1 or 2 Roma fans watching this video, which company made your favourite kits? Because retrospectively, Diadora made some brilliant ones in the late 90s. To finish the decade off, they were able to acquire Bologna and Udinese, but unfortunately Kappa, Lotto and the big boys will just dominate in Italy. And if I've learned anything from making these videos, I've learned the Italian brands, they rarely travelled well. So England, Germany, Spain and everywhere else, they weren't really touched by Diadora. Let's head into the 2000s because it felt this is where the damage started to really begin. And partially this coincided with the boom of football boots in this decade. Diadora prided themselves on quality Italian leather-made boots, which was a useful tactic in the 80s and 90s, but as I discussed before, Adidas and Nike, they were able to diversify themselves. Adidas had F50s, but they had the Predators. Nike had Mercurials, but they had Tiempos. And speaking from experience, when I was a kid in the 2000s, a player, they wanted to wear boots that kind of reminded them of how they played football. If you're wearing Adidas Predators, you're going to be a bit of a central midfielder. But if you're wearing Tiempos, you're going to be on the wing. And like I say, Diadora just focused on one design, just in different colourways. Plus, they lost a lot of their talent. Still being a family-run business in the 2000s, they weren't able to financially compete with the other companies. And especially Nike in this era, they'd taken the learnings from the phenomenon that was the Jordan shoe, and they focused so much more on athletes, tailoring the boots around them. I mean, Maldini briefly wore Diadora boots in the 2000s, apparently. I mean, to be fair, Francesco Totti, he had special boots and shin pads made for him prior to the 2006 World Cup. But again, it was limited, and it was just limited to Italy. Saying this, it did feel that Diadora were able to diversify their football kits in the 2000s. They acquired Aston Villa, Fiorentina, Napoli, Rangers. They even won the Roma rights back in 2003. So from a club point of view, they were in a fantastic position. No, they didn't have any big international rights anymore, but they had large Italian teams and even some good-sized British ones. So they were in a good position. How did they nearly end up going bankrupt in the late 2000s? Look, like I said, I've done a lot of videos on these topics, and one of the reasons, 99% of the time, is because of Nike and Adidas. They bought up so many of the surrounding companies, they had so much more of a marketing spend to go at, and I'm not saying it was a direct plot from those two to Diadora, but one way or another, they were going to get pushed out of the market. Look, how many Nike and Adidas ads did you see in the 2000s? How many Diadora ones? Because I cannot remember a single one. But other than that, apparently they were trying to get into too many sports too quick, and they weren't able to cope. Approaching the 2010s, Diadora was struggling financially. Sales were declining, especially in America, and apparently they had to restructure the company where they needed to cut staff and also reduce their already limited marketing spend. This led to Geox, another Italian company, buying Diadora in 2009. Geox were known for their breathable shoes. That's all I've got on them really. But the proposition was that Geox would turn Diadora into more of a lifestyle brand, whilst then also focusing on retro shirt releases, very similar to Kappa. Going into the 2010-2011 season, the best team wearing the kits would be FC 20. I mean, going from big Champions League clubs their roster was sparse, which would just further reduce their brand exposure going into the next few years. Look, there's not a lot to speak about Diadora in the 2010s. They lost so many of the large football teams they used to make the kits for, and football boots were mainly just made by Nike, Adidas and Puma. They worked with a little amount of lower league teams. I mean, notable names were Birmingham, Vasco da Gama, but the downfall was well and truly in effect. I mean, heading into this current decade, Geox Diadora's parent company filed for bankruptcy in 2020, which led them to close one of their factories in Serbia, seeing over 1,200 job losses. So, where is Diadora now? Well, with this current season, they're working with a handful of teams. Simba is probably the main one of the better teams in the Tanzanian league. But my point is, the presence in football is coming from the retro shirt boom that we've seen over the last 10 years. But going from working with the biggest tennis player of the 70s to the best striker of the 80s, it's evident that Diadora had a huge rise and an even bigger fall. But let me know what you think of Diadora. I'm sure if you grew up in the 80s or 90s, you'll have a massive soft spot for them. But me growing up in the 2000s, they just weren't a big name. If you could leave a like, leave a comment, like say, tell me what you think, subscribe if you enjoyed it, but thanks for watching.